Hi, I'm Nathan. You can find me on Twitter at GreatNateMTG, and this is the third video in my Blue-White-Red Geist video series, Sideboarding against Affinity. Now, if you watched my previous video, the Blue-White-Red Deck Tech, you'll notice that I intentionally left off the sideboard. I think that there's a lot of great deck techs and great deck lists that include the sideboard, but I wanted to go into the sideboard in depth. I know that when I first started playing Modern, it was a bit overwhelming with regards to the size of the format, and I did not know all of the time like why certain cards were in sideboards, and the ones that were, what other decks they might be good at. So I wanted to try to create a video that broke that down a little bit more and hopefully gives you guys the information that you need to go craft your own sideboards for your own metagames at your local store. For our metagame analysis, we're going to be using Magic Online as a reference. So with that being said, let's take a look here. This is the top 3 decks as of March 27, 2014 as reported by MTG Goldfish. And let me just take a moment to say that I think MTG Goldfish does a fantastic job. I think that their site is great on the financial side. It's great for looking at the metagame, looking up deck lists, seeing the results for various events. I think MTG Goldfish is becoming one of my favorite Magic sites, and if you haven't checked it out yet, you definitely should. So that being said, what is Affinity? Now, most of you probably already know, but for those that don't, Affinity is a very aggressive deck that plays very low cost and in some cases free artifact creatures so that it can more or less just vomit its hand onto the table and begin attacking you the following turn and killing you before you can really mount much of a defense. It's a very powerful deck in the right hands, and conversely you need to know what its powerful cards are so that you can effectively combat it. So what is our plan? Well, I don't know if you've read Mike Flores' article, Who's the Beatdown? If you haven't, I also recommend that. But in this matchup, they are clearly, obviously, the beatdown deck, and we are the control deck. We want to use our removal and control spells against key cards to slow them down and disrupt their plan so that our more powerful cards can take over later. We want to use our life total to buy us a bit of time and help us make the best plays that we can. And really, when the opportunity presents itself, we do want to try to close the game down quickly. Affinity plays cards like Cranioplating, which we'll discuss later, that put on the right creature can suddenly end the game out of nowhere. So you want to tempo them down, you want to control them, control the board, but you also want to try to close the game out as efficiently as you can when the time is right. So what are Affinity's best cards? Well, Signal Pest, Steel Overseer, Arcbound Ravager, Etch Champion, and Cranioplating, and we'll talk a little bit about each. Signal Pest is a great candidate for Lightning Bolt and Electrolyze, Lightning Helix. A lot of times it's one of the first creatures that they will play. They'll play a card like Memnite, which costs 0 and is a 1/1, or a card like Ornithopter, which costs 0 and is a 0/2 flyer. They'll play out their free creatures and their Signal Pest in the hopes to buff those creatures with the triggered battle cry on the following turn and do extra damage. Signal Pest is one of your prime targets if you're running Electrolyze, because you can often 2-for-1 your opponent, meaning you can kill two of his cards for one of yours. Steel Overseer, he's also a prime candidate for Electrolyze and any of your other removal spells. If you can, he's also a great card to 2-for-1 with Electrolyze because they've invested a little bit more mana into him. And in a pinch, he can be spell snared. Now, a note on spell snare: you really want, if you can, to hold spell snare up primarily for Cranioplating, and I think your secondary spell snare target is Arcbound Ravager. Since I mentioned Arcbound Ravager, let me talk about why he's problematic. So if they resolve an Arcbound Ravager, let's say you don't have a Spell Snare and it resolves, and you go Lightning Bolt, Arcbound Ravager, well, they can sack a bunch of different artifacts in response to pump him up, to make him bigger so that your Lightning Bolt doesn't kill him. And if you think you're cute and you want to try, okay, well, a Lightning Bolted, and you're doing these sacking shenanigans, so I'm going to Lightning Bolt it again in response to those triggers on the stack, well, he can then sack himself to his own ability, and then do something like activate an Inkmoth Nexus in response and put all of those counters on Inkmoth Nexus. So Arcbound Ravager can just be a giant pain to deal with when he comes down. A better target is something like Path to Exile, and if they've tapped out to play him, that's probably a good time to do that. But again, if you don't have any other choices, he is a prime candidate to use a Spell Snare on, even though you primarily want to save them for Cranial Plating. Then there's Etch Champion. Etch Champion, if they have Metalcraft, which they're going to have Metalcraft, he's a card that's very difficult for you to interact with. You can't kill him with any of your removal spells because he can't be targeted. You do have an answer out of the board, which we'll talk about a bit in Engineered Explosives, but it's kind of slow and clunky, and ideally you'd want to use that card to kill multiple cards. So you really want to hold up cards like Mana Leak, or if they haven't, he costs less than Cryptic Command, but Cryptic Command, if that's an option, you want to counter Etch Champion with your Mana Leaks and your Cryptic Commands if possible. So that's an overview of their best cards. Now, some cards to keep in mind are Inkmoth Nexus, which I mentioned previously, Galvanic Blast, and Master of Ethereum. Inkmoth Nexus is important because it is Infect. It's more like your life total's at 10, and if they're able to equip a Cranial Plating to it, it can kill you very quickly. So you want to be aware of that card. It does also get pumped by Blinkmoth Nexus, and which it hits for 2, and that's a reasonable clock. So there's that. Something else to keep in mind, because we are going to be trading our life total to buy time and to ensure best lines of play, you want to keep in mind that most decks run 2 copies of Galvanic Blast. So you don't want to get down to 4 life and feel like you're fine when they can just suddenly send it to your face and kill you. And then there's Master of Ethereum. It's probably going to be too big for you to handle with Lightning Bolt. Not every list runs it, but you want to be aware that it's out there in case you're trying to play around it, hold Path to Exile up for a better target. That's one of them. So we talked a bit about our cards, but these are our best cards in the Affinity matchup. Path to Exile hits all of their creatures, regardless of size, except for Etch Champion. Lightning Bolt kills a bunch of their dudes, so does Lightning Helix. Electrolyze and Spell Snare in this matchup are probably our best cards. Spell Snare because it kills a lot of their permanents before they even resolve, and Electrolyze because it can get you ahead on cards by 2 for 1 in your opponent. I want to talk just a moment about lines of play. I had mentioned, exchanging your life total for time, or to ensure that you have the best line of play. And some of you probably already get what I'm saying, but maybe some of you might also appreciate a quick example. So here's one. Let's say that Affinity is on the play and you have these 3 cards in your opening hand. Now, it's not your whole opening hand, but let's say you have these 3 relevant cards. And they go, Memnite, Ornithopter, Signal Pest, Mox Opal, Dark Citadel. Well, you haven't even played a land yet. And you know that already they're going to be able to attack you for 3 and possibly more if something happens. So when it's your turn, what you're going to want to do is play Steam Vents untapped, even though you're going to take 2. And then on their turn 2, their attack swing, that's where the decisions come into play. Again, there are some cards that are extremely problematic for you. Cranial Plating probably being, public enemy number 1. So a smart Affinity player might look at your untapped mana and know, hey, they probably have an answer available. Maybe they have a Spell Snare available. Well, I really want to resolve Cranial Plating, so I'm going to attack, and I'm not going to play Cranial Plating. And what I'm going to do is hope that they bolt my Signal Pest. That way I can resolve Cranial Plating. So you want to keep things like that in mind, because you're probably better off to just take the 3 damage, and then at their end step, if they haven't played anything else, then go ahead and Lightning Bolt the Signal Pest. They're probably going to play something. But, you know, in this scenario, you want to trade that life for the flexibility to Spell Snare something like Cranial Plating, because it can be so problematic for you. So that's an example of what I'm talking about, trading life for time in decisions. So let's get into this whole sideboard thing. Some things we want to consider when we're building a sideboard for any deck. How prevalent is that deck? You know, Affinity is close to 11% right now in the meta, which means we're going to see it a lot. So it's probably worth, you know, asking the question, is there a blowout hit card that only targets Affinity but just really hurts them? Because if so, we probably want to bring that in. And you also want to ask, like, how bad is the matchup? I'll give you an example, like Naya Aggro. I don't think it's being played as much as it was when Deathrite Shaman was first unbanned and Wild Nikado was unbanned. Deathrite Shaman was banned and Wild Nikado was unbanned. But that's a deck where, yes, you might want to bring in some hate, but our deck's already pretty well positioned to fight against. So you want to consider things like that. And then when you're selecting your cards, you know, you want to ask yourself, does Stony Silence affect other decks besides just Affinity? That way you're making your sideboard as diverse as you can. So this is the modern metagame right now. Not just the top 3, but the top, you know, however many decks are there right now. And as we're looking at the sideboard cards available to us, I'm going to make a mention when those sideboard cards also apply to one of these decks and some other decks that aren't on this list, say like Black-White Tokens or Fairies or Naya. So let's take a look. These are the most, and there's another couple of cards that I haven't shown yet, but these are the cards people primarily bring in against Affinity. I'm not going to try to cover every card that Blue-White Red has access to that could potentially negatively impact Affinity, like say Wrath of God. Yes, it kills creatures, but it doesn't hit Inkmoth Nexus, it doesn't hit Cranial Plating. So it's not a card that I would typically bring in, although it does have a negative impact. I'm not going to review it because it's not a card that you would typically board in against Affinity. However, you know, if that's the only card you have access to, because, you know, that's how you've constructed your sideboard for your meta, and you do face it, you know, maybe it's a card you still want to bring in. But I mostly want to focus on the cards people are primarily bringing in against Affinity. So we have Path to Exile, Wear Tear, Stony Silence, and Shatterstorm. And a quick note on Path, I put it in here because the list that we're using as our example or as our model has only 3 Path to Exile in the main board. We also have Damping Matrix, Engineered Explosives, and Batterskull. So let's talk about it. Give me one quick second. I need to take a quick drink of water. Okay, so Path to Exile. Its usual downside is reduced because Affinity only runs 1 basic land, Mosylus. And it is a great one from a removal spell in that it hits all of their creatures, no matter the size, except for Etched Champion. It's also good against the other decks that I've listed. I don't need to say them because you can read for yourself. But if you're only running 3 Path in your main board, it's probably a decent idea to have 1 in the sideboard for the decks where you need to get rid of other problematic creatures like Wormcoil Engine, or creatures with Persist like Kitchen Finks. So moving along, we have Wear Tear. Wear Tear is going to sort of be an alternate answer if they happen to resolve a Cranial Plating, but it also does hit pretty much all of their cards, again, except for Etched Champion, because he gets protection from all colors. So Wear Tear is an excellent card to bring in this matchup, and it's just a good utility card in general. I mean, Modern is diverse. You can't plan for everything, and you're going to sometimes run into decks and they're going to play an enchantment, and you're going to be like, what? Who plays that card? Well, I'm glad I have Wear Tear in the sideboard. So, you know, it's a card that it just has utility against a lot of decks. It's very strong against Affinity, and it's probably should find a home in your sideboard. So Stony Silence. Stony Silence is great, I think, in the Affinity matchup because it turns off so many of the things that they depend on. You know, it'd be one thing if it just turned off, excuse me, Steel Overseer and Arcbound Ravager, but it also denies the mana. So I think Stony Silence is a great card, and as I said, it also does have some crossover by preventing pod activations and some of the artifacts that Tron uses to go and fetch lands and generate mana. So now we have the blowout card, Shatterstorm. This, outside of some very fringe cases, you know, if there happens to be other artifact decks out there, Shatterstorm is a dedicated hate card for Affinity. It is one slot that you're bringing in solely for Affinity, and when you're going to be facing it as often as you are, if they're at this like 11% mark like they are right now, like it is right now in Magic Online, because Magic is a game of variance, even sometimes where you draw the right card you may lose. You want to have a card like Shatterstorm, if it's available to you, that just says, boom, you're probably going to lose the game. So that's Shatterstorm. Damping Matrix, it's a fairly good option. There's some value in it because it also has some overlap with creature, with combo decks that rely on creatures such as Kiki-Jiki or enchantments like Splinter Twin. It is a turn slower, and it doesn't turn off as many things as Stony Silence, but it's an option. We have Engineered Explosives. I really like Engineered Explosives just in general in the board. It's another one of those catch-all cards like Wear Tear. You know, it can deal with permanents that you normally wouldn't have a game against, and against Affinity, it can be a blowout. A lot of their permanents cost, say, 2 mana, and you can kill a lot of their stuff that way. Even at 0 mana cost, if they have a bunch of Ornithopters and Memnites out, you can kill a bunch of those, and it also will hit Mox Opal at that point. So Engineered Explosives is a good value card to bring in against Affinity. And lastly, we have Batterskull. Batterskull is good in this matchup primarily for the life gain. When you gain life against an aggressive deck like Affinity, you really are setting them back. You know, in our earlier example, it kind of negates their whole first attack if they hit for 3 or 4 damage. Getting to gain life off Batterskull almost is, you can almost look at it as buying that whole extra turn back. Plus, because of Vigilance, you can attack, and if they have to start blocking at some point, you're going to kill their creatures, and you're going to continue gaining life, and it's a good card in the matchup. And it also has some good overlap with some other decks that you'd like to bring it in against. So what are we going to... All these cards are great, but ultimately, what do we want to bring in, and what are we going to want to take out of our deck? Well, this is the deck list from the second video, and guys, I'm sorry if this turns out to be a bad way to look at it. I thought just a text list might be kind of hard to read with small text, or maybe boring. This is just a screenshot from the deck out of Magic Online. I hope it's readable. If it sucks, if it's not, if you don't like it, let me know, and I'll figure something else out. But here's the deck. I'm not going to read over it. You can pause the video and check it out if you want. But we'll go ahead and move into what I think an ideal sideboard looks like. So if our sideboard is 0, we have no sideboard cards in it yet, this is where I would start for our matchup against Affinity. All of these cards have utility against other decks in the format. Wear Tear is a catch-all for a lot of decks. Engineered Explosives is a catch-all for a lot of decks. Batterskull is relevant in a good number of decks, and Stony Silence, while being extremely strong against Affinity, also has some play against some other decks as well, Tron, Melirapod. So I think that this is good. This is 6 cards, so you're bringing in, you know, enough where you're likely to see 1 or 2 of these, and I think that they're all better than the cards that we'd be taking out, which are going to be these. So Remand, Remand can oftentimes be such a great card, but in this matchup, I think it's pretty bad because their stuff is so cheap, and at best it's just cantripping. And while a cantrip isn't bad, I'd rather Remand just be a Wear Tear or a Stony Silence. So I think Remand is better in other matchups, and we should pull it out. And then Geist of St. Traft. Now, I sideboard maybe different than some people might. I don't generally take out all of my copies of Geist, even in matchups where people say he's not so good against. You guys can probably hear about that car. Sorry, it's my neighbor. But anyway, yeah, I don't generally take out all of my Geist because he is our primary win condition. And even when you reduce the number and games go longer or grindier, which you play enough Affinity matches and you'll find out they typically can go longer and grindier than you expect. It's kind of nice to top deck later in the game, because if they don't have an answer, which they probably won't, Geist can win you the game. And also, Geist of St. Traft isn't as bad against this aggressive deck maybe as others, because their creatures are so weak. You know, if you're top decking and you top deck Geist and they top deck a Mem Knight, you're still going to be able to attack into that Mem Knight, because it cannot kill Geist of St. Traft. Their creatures are so small. And then this one, Vendilion Clique, initially I thought it might be worth keeping in, because you can play it at instant speed, say at the end of their draw step, to get rid of a Cranioplating or an Etched Champion. And it also does trade for some of their cards, like in a blocking scenario, because their toughness is so small. And I still think it could have some utility, but I just can't help but feel like Vendilion Clique's really just better against combo and control decks. And against a deck like Affinity, you know, I want some better answers. I'd rather have like Engineered Explosives and kill a bunch of their dudes, or I'd rather just have Shatterstorm and kill all of their artifacts. So I feel pretty good about this. I think this is a reasonable decision. Quick review again, we're going to put into the sideboard for bringing in against Affinity 1 Wear Tear, 2 Stony Silence, an Engineered Explosives, a Shatterstorm, and a Batterskull, and we're going to be taking out 2 Remand, 2 Geist of St. Traft, and 2 Vendilion Clique. So we're just about done, but you know, I thought it might be good to also let you guys know what Affinity would be bringing in from their sideboard. So some of the primary cards you're going to want to play around might be Spell Pierce. Afterboard, you may or may not see it. It's hard to say. I know most lists run Thoughtseize, and I think a good number are running Spell Pierce now, but nothing's worse than getting, you know, your 2-for-1 Electrolyze, Spell Pierced, and then you're behind. So you want to be aware of that. Thoughtseize, it's not really, you really can't play around it. They're going to play it and they're going to take a card, or they aren't, but you want to be aware that it's there. Grafdigger's Cage, you know, they're trying to deny you access to extra value from Snapcaster Mage with cards in your graveyard. And then there's Spellskite, you know, they want to retarget all of your 3 mana, or rather 3 damage burn spells like Lightning Helix Bolt, or for that matter even Electrolyze, at Spellskite instead of that permanent. Fortunately, Wear Tear kills it, Spell Snare kills it, Shatterstorm kills it, and Stony Silence prevents its activation. So they'll probably bring it in, but we have plenty of answers to it. Some less common sideboard cards, but other ones you may want to be aware of. Relic of Progenitus, Rest in Peace can be annoying for us, and they're not as common, but Blood Moon and Choke, played at the right time by your opponent, can be absolutely murderous. So you want to know that they're there. Fortunately, after sideboarding, you're bringing in Wear Tear, so and Engineered Explosives. So if one of these does happen to resolve, you hopefully you will have an answer for it. So that's it. That's the Affinity sideboarding guide. I hope that for those that already knew this information, I hope it was just a confirmation of what you already knew, and I hope it was at least somewhat entertaining. And for the newer players, I hope that this was helpful. I hope this gives you a better insight into how to think about sideboarding, cards that may be, cards that are available. And yeah, thanks for watching, guys. I appreciate it. Comment in YouTube with positive feedback or negative feedback. Let me know what you like, or let me know of ways you think I can improve. Follow me on Twitter at GreatNateMTG, and hopefully I will have the Splinter Twin video up soon.